know which one I'm talking about. Wow, this is it. I know. That's all right. You can do it. You'll see it. Paparazzi. Good evening. My name is Linnea Polite, and I'm the gallery director here at Vashon Center for the Arts, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of VCA. I actually want a big applause for these talks are made possible by the generous support of Tom and Ida Gay Nicolino and Ellen Kritzman. So I really want to thank them. And just a reminder that all of our talks are free for youth under 18. And also just to do a quick announcement about the next talk, after we have this fabulous talk, is Anne Charlotte Gavel Adams, and she's going to be talking on the weekend of our garden tour, which is Saturday, June 22nd at 12 noon, and she is a professor, retired professor from the UW of Swedish folklore and stories, and she's going to talk about trolls, as in like our Oscar the Bird King troll. So that's going to be on Saturday, June 22nd at 12 noon. So next, I'm going to introduce Bianca, who is the, I don't know exactly your title, but with Vashon Nature Center, because this talk is in collaboration with Vashon Nature Center. We do some of our talks, and they bring us these fabulous people, such as Tessa. So I'll let her introduce Tessa. This is Bianca.
Wow, I can't see anybody with this spotlight. You're going to have fun up here, Tessa. My name is Bianca, and I'm the science director for the Vashon Nature Center. Thanks for coming, everybody. Tessa and I first met when we were doing our doctorates together at the University of Washington, and she's on our science advisory committee. You still are, by the way. And Tessa has done a lot for advancing the ecology and conservation of the Puget Sound, and now on a national level, Tessa is chief of staff of the National Nature Assessment, where she is appointed for the next 4 years to do a big overall look at nature nationally and the state of nature in the United States. She's an aquatic ecologist, and she was, after she got her doctorate, she went to the University of Washington, Tacoma, and was working for the Puget Sound Institute. And she worked in aquatic ecosystem restoration and conservation with looking at both social and ecological systems. She was also the managing director of the Ocean Modeling Forum for 8 years while she was there. And that's where she led teams of stakeholders in looking at all sorts of ocean management priorities for the Puget Sound. She received a Northwest Straits Environmental Leadership Award in 2023, and she's just an all-around amazing speaker, and I always like to hear her. I've heard her speak at the Salish Sea Ecosystem Conference, where I think you also got an award for like best talk one year, and so I'm really excited to hear her talk tonight. So thanks and welcome, Tessa.
I just want to say I'm totally comfortable with the spotlight, no issue whatsoever. The last thing you want when you get up to talk is to have somebody say, she's an amazing speaker, because now I really have to wow you. Anyway, thank you very much to the VCA, thank you to the Vashon Nature Center for the invitation. Thank you all for being here tonight. My name is Tessa Francis. Yes, I am currently the Chief of Staff for the at the U.S. Global Change Research Program. I'm going to be wearing multiple hats tonight, however, when I talk to you, so I'm going to try to remember which hat I'm wearing at which time. Sometimes it's going to be a University of Washington hat. Sometimes it's going to be a federal government hat. You'll probably recognize when I'm wearing the federal government hat because I'll use a lot more acronyms when I'm in that hat, but I'll try to be clear as we go through. So, I want to start with an orange tree. My brother took this picture yesterday. It's the orange tree in the backyard of the house where I grew up. I grew up there with my mom and my brother still lives there, in fact, which is how he could take the picture. He wasn't sneaking into somebody's backyard. The house is in Los Angeles, and when I was a kid, whenever I felt lonely or sad or I needed to think, or I just needed some space, I would climb this orange tree. I would sit in the crook of a couple of its larger limbs and just hang out, just be in the tree. I would sit there for, honestly, hours, just sort of feeding off of the tree. You know, sometimes literally, because the oranges are actually really tasty. But the point is that at a very early age, I felt a very strong connection to nature, even a small slice of nature like a single fruit tree in a backyard. I viewed nature as nourishing. And as I got older and more mobile, I got that nourishment from the beach. And just sitting on the sand and just being. And in fact, I still do that. My dad passed away in 2020, and when it came time for me to give a speech at his memorial service, I went to the beach and sat on the sand to write. Because the sand helped me. I have gotten nourishment from nature throughout my life, in fact. And so when I started having kids, I moved to Vashon. And not just because it meant improving my station, because I was joining island royalty by marrying into the McMurray Middle School teacher Cornelius Lopez's family. That's not the only reason why I came. But I also came because I knew I wanted my kids to have abundant nature nearby so that they could also be nourished in that same way. And maybe many of you also moved to Vashon to get closer to nature. And maybe it isn't an orange tree that fills your tank, that nourishes you. And probably it isn't, because what is true is that nature holds about as many values to people as there are people. Some people value and appreciate wildlife. Maybe that's you. Some people just really love biodiversity and complex interactions between species and nature. Maybe you are like other people who just feel inspired by beautiful views. Maybe you value nature for the solace and the serenity that you feel when you're alone in a forest. Maybe you just really get off on the smell of damp soil or moss. And these values of nature aren't exclusive to wilderness, let's be clear. They can be found even in a city park. There's an op-ed in the Seattle Times this week, maybe you saw, written by a physician and health researcher and a colleague of mine, Howard Frumkin. And he extolled in that op-ed the virtues of city parks, which he argues have superpowers to fight against isolation and segregation, and to support civic engagement, and even trust in institutions. So parks make our cities healthier places to live where they exist. And in fact, there's a ton of research showing that our physical, mental, and emotional health is improved by nature, including city parks. And our lives depend on nature in so many other ways as well. We depend on nature for our economies, for our livelihoods. And sometimes those livelihoods are connected to our culture, our cultural heritage, and our communities. And nature offers us protection and security against disaster. And so my work has really focused on observing and measuring nature, assessing nature's importance to our lives, and understanding how nature might change, and therefore what we can do in order to save it and protect all those benefits to us that we receive from nature. So tonight I'm going to tell you about this work in 3 acts, like This American Life. We're going to move from a small story about shorelines to a slightly larger story about an estuary and region, and then finally we're going to get national. So Act 1, Puget Sound shorelines. Act 2, Puget Sound futures. And Act 3, taking stock of nature. Okay, so Act 1. I'm putting on my UW hat for this talk. This is work that I did while at the University of Washington's Puget Sound Institute in collaboration with colleagues from NOAA and supported by funding from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, the EPA, and Washington Sea Grant. So when I was at UW, which was for about a dozen years, I spent a lot of time working on forage fish. And in case that is a new term for you, forage fish are small schooling fish that are called forage fish because they are forage. They are food for a lot of other critters, birds, larger fish, mammals. Some examples of forage fish that we have here in Puget Sound are my favorite, Pacific herring. Smelt is another common forage fish here. And what is so cool about forage fish to me is that they are connected to the ecosystem and to people in so many of the ways that I just talked about. I'm getting this out of the way. I'm going to go to this one. And connected in so many of the ways that we just talked about. They are food for other animals, and so they give us a chance to focus on food webs and species interactions. They are the focus of fisheries, and so they're connected to our economies and our livelihoods. They're rich in oils, and so they support human health. And they're at the center of many indigenous cultural practices and rituals, including the harvesting of herring eggs from cedar branches, which you can see in this picture here. Now, the astute among you have noticed that not all of these pictures are of forage fish. These, in fact, are salmon. They snuck in there. And in part, salmon are here because when they're young and when they're adults, they eat forage fish. So they're an example of a food web connection. But they're also here because when they are juveniles, they serve very similar roles as forage fish. And they have very similar habitats as juveniles in Puget Sound. And so for the purpose of this talk, for Act 1, I'm lumping them in there with forage fish, and I hope you forgive me for that. So forage fish are cool. They're important. And for the past several decades, they have been somewhat in trouble. So we know, for example, from decades of monitoring that Pacific herring, are largely in decline. So what I'm showing you here are time trends of abundance estimates using two different ways of measuring. That's the two different colors. There's a red symbols and lines and blue symbols and lines. Two different ways of measuring herring stocks, or we call them stocklets, little stalks. The 19 different herring stocklets that we have in Puget Sound, including in our own Quartermaster Harbor. And what you can see, you don't need to care too much about anything except that you see, in general, downward trends. They have been declining, for the most part, for the last several decades. And since today you've agreed to let me call salmon forage fish, I'll also show you some salmon data showing basically the same story. It doesn't matter whether you look at body mass or abundance or survival. You can see that in Puget Sound, for the most part, there's variability, but for the most part, over the last several decades, our salmon have been in decline in Puget Sound as well. And when we think about Puget Sound, which is an urban estuary, we shouldn't be too surprised about these data because we know that the Salish Sea, and especially the Puget Sound portion, in these waters, marine organisms are treated to just a host of insults that are concentrated especially along shorelines, which is where the juveniles of these species spend most of their time growing up. So agricultural and industrial runoff pollutes the water, dams block migration pathways, dredging and shipping degrade open water habitat, docks and other structures degrade the shoreline. And these stressors can influence fish at multiple levels of organization, from physiological all the way up to the population scales. So tonight I'm going to zero in on just one of these stressors, which is shoreline armor. So shoreline armor, if that's a new term for you, is hardened structure along the shore like a bulkhead or a seawall, designed to protect shoreline property from being washed out to sea. So the most recent estimate that I'm aware of is that 30% of the Puget Sound shoreline is armored. That number jumps to over 50% when you look at unincorporated King County, most of which is Vashon shoreline, I'm sorry to say. So there's a lot of armor. So why is that a problem exactly? Well, shoreline armor has a lot of negative effects on beaches, we know. We know that it reduces the connectivity between terrestrial and marine habitats. We know that shoreline armor reduces the diversity of insects that are available on the beach, which are particularly tasty to juvenile salmon. Armor degrades beach slope and changes sediment composition. It decreases habitat for beach spawning forage fish like smelt. And so since we know that armor has these negative effects on the shore, And we also know that juvenile fishes are spending most of their time growing up in the shallow water just adjacent to the beach. We wanted to know whether armor is impacting the use of this critical nursery habitat for juvenile fishes as well, and whether restoring beaches by removing armor might turn that around. So we spent 2 years counting fish around Puget Sound, including one spot in our very own Dockton. We compared fish use of shallow water habitat at natural shorelines, at armored shorelines, and then at restored shorelines. So we had three sites at each one of our stations. And we asked, were there differences in the abundance of fish at each of these shoreline types? And I'll just cut to the chase and tell you that, well, the story is sort of mixed. So what we found is that herring definitely prefer natural shorelines over either armored or restored shorelines. Chum salmon don't really care, they just want eelgrass. That's where you find the chum. Chinook salmon also don't really care, they just care about specific locations in Puget Sound that are on their way between their spawning stream and the ocean. They're on a migratory pathway, and if one of our stations fell on that migratory pathway, that's where we found the Chinook salmon. And smelt, who even knows what smelt are doing? The patterns were so random that we couldn't assign any relationship to armor for smelt. So we had sort of mixed results. This was based on 2 years of surveys, 6 different sites. We thought maybe we were taking too narrow of a look to really capture the patterns because, after all, fish move around a lot. They're very patchy in distribution, and it's maybe hard to get some strong results in a limited data set. So we expanded our scope. We collected data for 2 more years of throwing a net in the water and counting fish. And to those data, we added more data from other people who've been collecting fish data for decades all around Puget Sound, and asked the same question. Does shoreline armor affect how fish are using shorelines? And this time we asked that question at multiple spatial scales, starting from a small spatial scale that you might think of as a stretch of shoreline in front of somebody's house, all the way up to a basin scale like central Puget Sound. So I'm going to take you through the results, but first I'm going to break down for you what you're going to see in the graphs. Okay, so here I'm showing you results for Chinook salmon. We're going to have the same 4 species I showed you before. And on the vertical axis is essentially a measure of the effect of armor on abundance. So this line in the middle here is sort of the zero effect line. Above the zero line in the green means there's a positive effect of armor, so fish are more abundant at armored sites than not armored sites. And below that zero line, there's a negative effect, so fish are less abundant at armored sites than non-armored sites. And then along the horizontal axis is our spatial scale. So we start with the scale of an individual house or a small stretch of shoreline all the way up to the basin. Couple more things to say, which is that all of these effect sizes, so the difference between abundance of fish at armored and unarmored sites, pretty weak across all of the results. So we're not talking about large differences here. And so in the case, and then the other thing to say is that these whiskers, if they cross the zero line, that means we don't get to count them. That's essentially no effect. That's a non-significant result. So you're only looking for effects that are all in the green or all in the red. So for Chinook salmon, we would say that overall, we see a weakly positive effect of armor on abundance at these small spatial scales, right? So we see more Chinook salmon at armored sites until we start getting at these really large spatial scales. All right, I'm going to reveal the rest of the results. And what you can see when you just take a quick look at first is that there's no real strong patterns across all the fish species. So if we look at the salmon species in general, there's more positive effects. So chum and Chinook salmon are more likely to be found at armored sites compared to unarmored sites, and the forage fish are less likely to be found at armored sites. That changes depending on the spatial scale you're talking about, and again, they're pretty weak associations and they're inconsistent across spatial pattern. So The conclusion here is that the differences between the salmon patterns and the forage fish patterns really have to do with their ecology, we think. If you think about a salmon, what a salmon is trying to do is it's basically on a migratory pathway in more or less a single direction between the river or stream where it was born and the open ocean. And so it's going to go along that migratory pathway and use that shoreline whether it's armored or not. It doesn't really have a choice. That is its pathway. And so if you're migrating along an armored shoreline, you're going to be found on that armored shoreline. So we see more positive associations because there's just a lot of armor out there. In contrast, the ecology of forage fish is really different. They don't have to follow a single direction. They basically live onshore when they're tiny, and then they go offshore when they're old. And then they mix around in a basin. So they can be more selective about what shoreline types they're using. And in this case, we see that they are choosing to stay away from armor more often than not. So slightly less dramatic results than we would have expected, but I think it's still fair to say that overall, we have some evidence that shorelines that are armored are less than amazing for fish. So what can we do about that? Well, we can remove the armor. Still probably a very good idea. The Shore Friendly program is an example of a program working with homeowners who want to improve their shoreline habitats, helping them with engineering and with financial strategies. Other groups are working to remove armor where possible on shorelines that are not held by private homeowners or individuals, like in Docton Park where the armor was removed, or here at the Tahlequah Ferry Dock. And when that restoration happens, you can be sure that the Vashon Nature Center is there with others to monitor the situation and track the progress. So while I think this is a real success story, and it gives me hope about the future of Puget Sound shorelines. Okay, Act 2. Still wearing my UW hat. Very clear, not speaking for the federal government yet, but different collaborators and different sponsors. So this is work that I led while at the Puget Sound Institute. It was funded by the Allen Foundation and in collaboration with a whole lot of other colleagues from a lot of different organizations, which will make sense in a moment. So way back in Act 1, I talked about all of the stressors concentrated around shorelines that affect forage fish and other marine organisms. But if we zoom out, what we see is that the shoreline habitat exists within a larger ecosystem that links terrestrial and freshwater and marine ecosystems. And human activities like growing populations and land conversion and climate change threaten those ecosystems and species, as well as the benefits that we derive from them. And the connections among these systems are really poorly understood, and we lack sufficient information at present to understand the impacts of future change and to evaluate trade-offs between different management decisions, or to set restoration and protection priorities that account for the interconnectedness of these systems under scenarios of future change. We know that the ecosystems are connected, we know those connections are important, but our region just lacks the tools to evaluate how future change propagates through the system and affects nature and all of the ways in which we depend on nature. And really what we would like to know is how will climate change and population growth and development affect Puget Sound nature and its benefits to people? And when we ask these questions using simple flowcharts, and I know you're saying to me, Tessa, that ain't no simple flowchart, but I promise you it is, because really what I'm showing you here is an abstraction of just a few components of the Puget Sound social ecological system from terrestrial to marine habitats. But even when we use this simple abstraction, we know that there are a lot of connections, but it gets complicated very, very quickly, because as you can see with all the lines here, everything is interconnected. We can link agricultural runoff to agricultural production, in this case, water extraction, to the amount of water flowing in streams in the summer. That has an effect on juvenile salmon in streams, which ultimately has an effect on the number of adult spawning fish, spawning salmon, which ultimately affects orcas, and that feeds back into our sense of place and our well-being that we derive from being able to go down to Point Robinson and take pictures of orcas. And that's just one simple little chain here. But there's so many feedbacks involved here and so many direct and indirect interactions that this mess of spaghetti is just too much for our brains to do the work. So we need math. We need, in fact, some pretty hefty-duty mathematical models to address these questions. So what we need we need real mathematical models, and we need to link them together to address these questions, to get them to talk to each other. And so this project, the Puget Sound Integrated Modeling Framework, is really one of a very few of its kind that links together these big models and is just a Herculean task, but that's needed to cover the full linked social ecological system in the Puget Sound, and in an effort to provide a tool to support decision-making in the face of future unknown change, so that we can understand the threats to nature and its benefits and take action to protect it. So what we have is a set of models with humans and the benefits of nature at the center, and models of the food web, of growth and land development, of the watersheds and of the estuary, all linked together, driven by external factors such as population growth, land use decisions, and climate change. We have 5 modeling teams, and the project has been scoped for 3 years. I say we. It's not me anymore. I have to let go. It is not me. It's in the hands of my capable colleagues now, but I still feel part of the team. Okay, but that's just my attachment problem, isn't it? Okay, so these are the 5 models. We have a terrestrial model of population growth and development that can predict land use categories under scenarios of population growth. We have a watershed model that predicts hydrological patterns and the export of chemicals and nutrients out of watersheds under scenarios of land cover change, and can also be used to evaluate the impacts of green infrastructure on water quality. We have an estuarine and marine circulation model that models the biogeochemistry of the Puget Sound and predicts primary production. And then we have a food web model that is the whole marine food web and also can evaluate scenarios of fishing. All of those models link into the human system model because all of the benefits that we derive from nature come out of all of these different boxes. And we can also model the equitable distribution of those benefits among different communities and also the effects of different governance structures on those benefits. And so just an example about how these models are linked together, they essentially talk to each other. They pass information from one to the other. So this terrestrial model will pass predictions of land cover patterns to the watershed model, which will do its thing, and then output predictions of freshwater amounts and water quality, including nutrients and toxins. It will pass that down to the estuarine model that receives that water flow and those nutrients and toxins, will do its thing, and then it will pass information about nutrients available in the food web and toxins that move through the food web and temperature and pH factors that influence food web dynamics to the food web model. And ultimately, what we're interested in is using those models not just because the modelers have a good time playing around with them, but because we can use them to evaluate how we're doing under future scenarios of global change in terms of the benefits that we derive from nature. And the way that we're defining those benefits is we're borrowing from the Puget Sound Partnership, which has established these Puget Sound vital signs as these measures of the health of Puget Sound with 5 major objectives: thriving species and food web, functioning habitat, healthy water quality, healthy human population, and vibrant quality of life. So these are all features, these are all essentially outcomes that we'll be tracking using this linked modeling suite. So one example of how this linked modeling suite could be used and how you could only actually answer the question with this linked modeling suite is asking about how we might manage this chemical called 6-ppd quinone. So if you've never heard of that, it's essentially this deadly component in tire dust that kills coho salmon and other salmon, but mostly coho, in streams before they spawn. And the question is, how can we manage that? You know, what management actions can we take to limit the delivery of 6-ppd quinone into our streams? And what effect will that have on, ultimately, on the production of adult salmon? How do those predictions change under scenarios of climate change and under scenarios of future land use? So each one of these different colors represents a different model in the suite. So we can evaluate population growth and land use scenarios and climate change scenarios and management strategies, and ask how those changes in land cover characteristics, like the prevalence of roads and where they are, might influence runoff from roads, which affects the concentration of the toxin in salmon-bearing streams, causes mortality of juvenile salmon, and ultimately feeds back to populations of adult salmon. So because these dynamics travel from the uplands down into the marine waters, we really couldn't evaluate this without this linked set of models. So this is one example. They are at very early stages of the project. I essentially did this part, and then I said goodbye. So they are here where they are testing model sensitivity. They're just, at this point, still getting the models to talk to each other. What's cool about the project is they're sort of like going out to the public, going out to stakeholders and saying, hey, what do you think the important applications of this modeling suite are? Then they go back and they fix their models to adjust to those requests. Then they plan to take it back out to the public and say, here's some preliminary results. What do you think? How can we change this? So that there's not just people working at their computers by themselves, but they're getting some interaction with the stakeholders and the decision makers who can really use these tools. So this is a project that I'm really hopeful will provide a new tool to help us understand the impacts of a changing world and a changing Puget Sound, and how we can preserve nature and our connections to nature. Okay, we're at Act 3, guys. You gonna be okay? Everybody doing okay out there? Act 3, all right, here we go. I'm putting on a new hat. I'm in my government hat. It's all gonna be acronyms and jargon from now on. Okay, so what my new hat is a government hat. This is work that I am doing with the U.S. Global Change Research Program, where I am on detail from the U.S. Geological Survey. So as you know, the local stories that I've been talking about here about Puget Sound, about changing nature and its effects on our lives, those stories are repeated around the country. And while we have a lot of information about nature around the country, about what nature means to us, the current status of nature, and how it is changing, and what those changes will mean for our lives in the future, believe it or not, all that information has never been brought together into one place, allowing us to understand as a nation the status and trends of nature and how it might change in the future, and importantly, how we might act in order to stop that change and preserve the benefits that we get from nature. And we need this comprehensive national assessment so that we can understand how we might take action if we want to stop nature loss before it's too late. And so on Earth Day 2022, President Biden signed at this desk that just miraculously appeared in Seward Park with our senators and our governor and our representatives, Executive Order 14072, which basically says, thou shalt do a national nature assessment. There's the implementation of the United States Global Change Research Program, that's where I work, shall include an assessment of the conditions of nature within the United States. And so we shall. So we are. So we are doing this. So the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which is overseen by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, comprises 15 different federal agencies, all of which conduct or use research on global change, including nature change. And we will be conducting the first ever national nature assessment. and the report is to be delivered by 2026. So we're in a really, really big hurry, you guys. It's all happening really fast, and we are in the thick of it right now. The scope of the NNA, the National Nature Assessment, is to assess the status, observed trends, and future projections of U.S. lands, waters, wildlife, biodiversity, and ecosystems, and the benefits they provide, including connections to the economy, to public health, equity, climate mitigation, and adaptation, and national security. And in moving from Biden's very broad marching orders to an actual blueprint, we sent out a public request for information. We held tribal consultations. We looked at other assessments. We read the literature. We had extensive conversations with our federal steering committee. And through all these conversations, identified really two core ethics: that the National Nature Assessment would be use-inspired. That is, it wouldn't just be a report, a government report, another government report that would sit on the shelf, and it would be inclusive of multiple lived experiences, multiple ways of knowing, and be relevant to all communities in our nation. And our commitment to multiple ways of knowing is based in the idea that Indigenous knowledge is one of the many important bodies of knowledge that contribute to scientific, social, and economic advances, and to our collective understanding of the natural world. We are using pretty new federal guidelines on the use of Indigenous knowledge. We're engaging in tribal consultations at every step of the process, and holding listening sessions with other Indigenous groups to ensure that the National Nature Assessment incorporates multiple ways of knowing. So at the beginning, we sent out a request for information. We published it in the Federal Register. We invited public comment, asking people what they thought we should include in the National Nature Assessment, essentially asking people what they wanted to see, what they wanted us to talk about. We received over 3,000 comments. We held 3 Native Hawaiian engagements, 5 tribal consultations. We met with over 150 organizations in 45 states. We heard a lot from a lot of people, took all that information in, put it all together, and some major themes came through in terms of what people wanted to see in the National Nature Assessment. They wanted to know about conservation and natural resource management. They wanted to know about economic interests associated with nature. They wanted to know about safety and security implications of nature, and human health and well-being connections to nature. And then across all of this, a couple of cross-cutting themes also came out, which were the importance of climate and climate change, and also equity. Questions about equitable access to nature, equitable distribution of nature's benefits. So we've turned these broad themes into a list of chapters, which I will now share with you. So we're gonna have an overview chapter that's just like TLDR. If you can't read the report, you're just gonna pick up the overview and really read it really quick. Then we have assessment approach of NNA. That's just gonna talk about how we did the assessment and why, maybe talk a lot about Indigenous knowledge use, et cetera. And then really once you kind of get that like the nuts and bolts out of the way, we're really gonna lead with a chapter on bright spots, because we really don't want this to be a doom and gloom report. We want to emphasize that there are some places in America's nature where we are succeeding. There are things to be hopeful about. There are case studies that we can build on. We'll have a couple chapters that are just kind of straightforward status and trends chapters, status and trends and projections of nature, status and trends and projections of the drivers of change in nature. And then we have a series of chapters that are focused on the benefits of nature, right? So nature and cultural heritage, nature and the economy, nature and human health and well-being, and safety and security. And then we have these cross-cutting themes that I mentioned. We're gonna have chapters on climate change interactions with nature, how does climate feed back to nature loss and vice versa, and then nature and equity, these broader sort of equitable considerations when we think about nature and changes in nature. And then last, ending again on a hopeful note with a chapter called Opportunities for America's Nature. So this is really gonna focus on sort of the decision-making space and what actions are possible, what we've learned from the assessment, what examples are out there for success stories in terms of decision making and policy that we can lean on and maybe broaden to larger scales and implement at larger scales to benefit nature. So this is the science report, and our authors have all been onboarded. They're meeting right now. It's a huge group of people who are working incredibly hard. They're all volunteers, and we're really in the thick of it. Right now they're writing essentially annotated outlines of their chapters, which are due in like 3 weeks. So they're racing. So that's all really the science, and that's asking what the science tells us about what nature means to us and how it's changing and how those changes are affecting our lives. But we know, and especially sitting in this beautiful art space, we are reminded that people connect through their hearts more than through their brains. And art is a way to people's hearts. And so we are also hoping to nurture a number of associated products where we can engage artists' voices in the same ways that we're engaging science. We can ask artists to tell us what nature means to them, how they see it changing, and how it affects their lives. I can say right now for sure that we know there will be a poetry anthology. There will be a call coming out for poems this fall, and the anthology will be published in the summer by the American Academy of Poets Laureate. We're hoping for other artistic opportunities as well. We would love to engage with filmmakers and visual artists, and of course dancers and choreographers. So stay tuned for that. And please stay connected. So I mentioned that the authors are presently at work on their annotated outlines. We call this a zero order draft because we have weird names for things in the government. And that's going to be published and available for public comment this summer. And those comments really matter because this is just the author's ideas of what they think they're going to write about. It's essentially a chapter outline. It's bullet points. The whole point, and then we will go on the road and we will have a whole bunch of public engagement workshops where we and the authors will present these outlines and get feedback. And the feedback will ultimately really shift what the chapters contain. The authors will be obliged, because they're working for the federal government, to take into account those comments. So I really encourage people who are interested in this project to stay on the lookout and to share your thoughts, because we absolutely want to hear from you. And with that, I will say thank you and take any questions. I'm not going to be able to see you to call on you. Thanks. That would be helpful for me. Yes. Oh, the question is the sound too clean? I've heard that argument, right, that there's not enough primary production because there are not enough nutrients that are going into the Puget Sound. And actually, it would be beneficial if we increased nutrient delivery to Puget Sound and cranked up the primary production, right? Is that the behind your... Yeah, to summarize, things have changed. I mean, and one of the things that has changed is the amount of nutrients, sewage mostly, that has gone into Puget Sound. And the water is cleaner potential in some ways, but I guess my trouble with those questions is that I think that question doesn't acknowledge the fact that the baseline for everything has shifted. We're not really looking at the same baseline for what the right amount of nutrients in the Puget Sound waters is, because as you note, the food web has totally changed, and the entire system has totally changed. So to say that nutrient levels back then, or primary production levels back then, were the right levels compared to now, I think just ignores that the whole system has shifted and is continuing to shift. I've seen some model runs that crank up primary production in Puget Sound and ask what the results are. And Puget Sound is very driven by bottom-up processes. There's no doubt that you change primary production by adding nutrients to the water, you will affect everything upwards from that. Whether that's what you want, whether that's what we choose, all depends on what species you're fishing for, I guess. Okay, yeah. I'm pausing because I have to answer carefully. Oh, thank you. Will anything happen to the National Nature Assessment under a change of administration? The answer is, I don't know. I'll say that the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which is the program leading the National Nature Assessment, was created by an act of Congress. It's not a presidential action. And that act of Congress charges the U.S. Global Change Research Program with conducting assessments specifically on a regular basis of global change. And nature has been defined as part of global change. That's what I'll say. So if you have a live mic now, if you want to use the mic or speak really loud.
So I'll walk around with the mic.
Hi, Tessa. This is Patrick.
Hi,
Thank you
Patrick.
for a really cool talk, and it's a really exciting work. I guess the question I want to ask of you as a person is, and I don't want this to come across as dismissive of the work on modeling, but the reality is that in Puget Sound we have a model of science-based management, high reliance on modeling, high reliance on ecological research. I've done research on this myself with funding from the partnership that says something like 90% of the scientists who study Puget Sound are ecologists, and there's a small group of social scientists sort of talking to themselves. We don't manage fish, we manage people. And so my question for you, and that's part of that, which is part of the, I want to ask you about if you could wave your hands and say what kind of science should be done in the Puget Sound. And I know, I really appreciated how you laid out the different models that you're doing, but, I must say that I'm a bit of a skeptic about whether those are dollars that are well spent. We've spent tens of millions of dollars in modeling Puget Sound. And we're modeling to the point where we're just watching things blink out. And I also noticed the logical disconnect or incongruence between scientific knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge. And a lot of modelers will say, well, we'll just bring in that the indigenous knowledge into our models, and somehow we'll, model how people have interacted with these systems for tens of thousands of years since time immemorial. So I guess that my question for you is this, and I don't mean to, again, try to put you on the spot, but it's like, are we going down the right path with trying to model more and more and try to create those linkages between those various model systems that you were talking about? For what end? I mean, at the end of the day, we get a result that says we ought to do X or Y, and ultimately people might just be like, well, I want a nice house on the beach, and I want to cut down all the trees, and I want to put a bulkhead in, and if you threaten my ability to do that, I'll take you to court. And I have endless resources to do that. And so, you know, as opposed to investing in things like understanding social movements that will force change, understanding what people want, what are people willing to give up? Because it really is ultimately a decision about what are people willing to give up. We can't continue to drive the system like we are if we want to see it work. So I guess the question I want to ask for you is just like, if you were to wave your wand, would you say more money for more models, or less money for models, and more money for something else?
Clearly, I want the money for models because I wrote the grant. But I think there's room for both of us, Patrick. I don't think that this is the only work that should happen in Puget Sound. I think it's some of the work that should happen in Puget Sound, and I think everything else you said is I agree with, which is that it's only science. And science is only one part of decision making. I'm not a funder, fortunately, so I don't have to make the decision about where I should spend my money. I'm not a foundation. I'm an ecologist, and so there's work that I want to do, and so I pursue those opportunities. But I think that there should be, I don't think there's room for all of that. I think they're all priorities, but I don't think you can influence decisions without knowing which direction you want to go.
There is only X amount of dollars that are being willing to be spent on research to do this work, and there's not a lot of work for unorthodox or even non-science kind of research, because we kind of are captured by the belief that if we just do the natural science research, or even the social science, I'm not advocating for social science research, I'm advocating for non-science.
Oh, of course. I mean, I think, yes, of course. But I agree. I think that like I said, science, whether it's natural science or social science, is only part of what gets us to the future that we want. And that's partly why we're hoping for artistic efforts alongside of the science, because we recognize that science is only part of it. Yeah.
First of all, bravo. Bravo for what you're doing. It's really great to hear committed scientists coming together with the kind of passion and energy and work that you guys are demonstrating. So I want to start with that, you know. And then having consulted to the feds, I know that often there are a lot of silos in federal government. As part of your planning, are you going to infiltrate the different, some of the different departments that have a relationship to the environment, the ecology, but may not be directly connected to this, to kind of leverage the impact of what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate your comment about the siloed nature, and not just federal government, right? Like academia too.
Yeah.
But to be quite honest with you, managing relationships with 15 federal agencies is kind of enough for me right now. Like we have a pretty big group of feds on who are our federal steering committee and who are steering this project, and they're a combination of, you know, research users and researchers, and so ideally there's sort of a relationship there, an interaction between sort of, you know, people who are providing information and people who are using the information to make decisions, and assessment information can feed both the use and the research side. So, you know, I appreciate your comment about, like, I think our hope is by having this family of 15 federal agencies that, that we do that. There's a benefit to being associated with the executive office of the president because they also have a whole bunch of stuff that they're working on, and so there's a lot of interplay between the assessment and sort of the executive branch and the work that they're doing that's related. So we benefit from that a lot, and it remains to be seen whether they will listen to us. But
I just hope that it will seed, because it's a big study and it's a small study at the same time. And yet if it's a seed that can then go out to EPA, Corps of Engineers, Ecology, whatever, you know, wherever the playgrounds are for folks who are actually out in the field doing the work, I hope it gets out to them. You know?
I mean, and just appreciating the nuance in your question, like I think that one of the challenges that we're grappling with is how you bridge the gap between a national assessment and on-the-ground manager at a local Region 10 EPA, right?
Yeah.
So that's a challenge that we're thinking through.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I just had a quick question. You mentioned the silos in the federal government, and you are global change. What is your partnership internationally? Is there any crosstalk? Are you working, you know, throughout the world, because this is a global issue? And the second question is just to throw out there to mess up your entire presentation.
Yay.
So where does AI fit into all that?
Yeah.
You don't have to answer that. But the first one is there any cross
Actually, that second one's easier for me to answer because we just wrote artificial intelligence guidance for our authors, which is basically like the same guidance we give them for any of their writing. It's like you can't plagiarize a human, you also can't plagiarize a robot. Like you cannot use a robot to write your assessment. So sorry, you're gonna have to write your original work and you're gonna have to base it on actual research. So the AI part was easy. Good. That's the only challenge that we're facing in the assessment is like, can authors basically use AI to write an assessment? And the answer is no, they're not allowed to. The international connections are interesting. So, you know, there are a lot of international assessment examples to go to, and we have people who have worked on them on our author team and as part of our team. There's the only hardwired connection for the U.S. Global Change Research Program is with the IPCC because of the climate assessment connection. We share basically some of the sort of technical experts who are not the authors of the assessments, but they help produce the assessment. We share some of those technical people. So there's a lot of conversation. Honestly, it's mostly about scheduling and not so much about content. But there's, you know, an international assessment, and then there's also like it's a hard enough task for us to just do the national thing without getting distracted by what they do international. But there are lessons to be learned that we are trying to bring in for sure, and that's actually like the fun part. You're like, well, I've heard they've done really good assessments in Europe. I better go over there and meet with them and figure out what they're doing. So.
Thank you.
Hey there, thank you so much for your talk. It was really compelling. I am an artist, so that was really heartening and to note. And I am a naturalist artist as well, so extra connectivity there. My question is, what form will the NNA take in the end? Because the inclusivity you mentioned is impressive and really heartening, personally, that science is coming together with artists and of all stripes, you know, the arts, as well as traditional ecological knowledge. I have a hesitancy, just knowing the hesitancy to be hopeful, knowing how much weight science pulls in our society and how little weight the arts pull when it comes to decision making, and how little weight is given to traditional ecological knowledge. I say this also having worked for the last decade and a half with Indigenous ecology educators. So I suppose it's taking me a moment to get to the essence of the question, but is there a balancing factor? Will there be a balancing factor to give any more weight than is already given to non-science measures in this national nature assessment?
Yeah, I don't know how to, I go straight to sort of like calculating metrics of weight to try to answer your question, right, but that's the wrong way. So, I mean, if we just think, just to answer about the art question first, the presentation and preservation of presentation between science and art is so different. And it's sort of like this idea that Patrick was bringing up of like, well, the modelers just want to include traditional ecological knowledge in their models, but that's not actually how it goes. It's not how it really works. But we're also thinking about it in ways that make sense to artists. We're trying to think about it in ways that make sense to artists. So if you're a poet, it makes sense to you to answer a call to write poetry and to have your poem published in an anthology. You know, that is how you present the weight of your work. That is your arena. Just like the science arena, if we do our best job, we have a super slick website and people can download PDFs and they can, you know, click on figures that are animated, right? So I think part of it is looking to how, what the arts are for the artists and responding in that way. Also, though, we're limited by like federal government rules and, you know, money. So there's some realities there. With respect to Indigenous knowledge and the art, the influence of artists' voices as well, it was our aim to actually, because the writers have only just started talking to each other, the scientists, it was our aim to have the non-science voices presented to the scientists as additional input in their assessment. And so, for example, we are having an Indigenous-led special science journal issue, maybe multiple issues, that is separate from the assessment, that is not associated with the federal government, that is Indigenous-led articles. So they're still published because these are scholars who want to still receive benefits from publishing work. But the point is that it's outside of the Western framing of a science report, and it is the framing that they want, and it's led by them. And the idea is that that would be input to the science report. So there would be additional information taken alongside the scientific information. There would be additional sources of information, artist voices, traditional knowledge. It's tricky to work that timing, so that's what our hope is. And I hope we can thread that needle, but that's the best answer I can offer you in terms of our intentions.
Thank you so much.
Okay, are there any other questions? One more.
One more.
Okay, we'll take one more question and then we'll call it good.
Wait for the mic.
talking about collaborating, you know, it's a global thing. I was wondering if there was some kind of connection with maybe the people in Canada that are doing maybe some similar work in the Salish Sea, which is a lot like it is here and like it used to be here. And just as an aside, I would say that I imagine that the art part will probably end up being used to maybe sell the science to a general audience, because that's the thing that's going to catch people's attention and make an effect, maybe.
I tend to agree with that second point. In terms of the expanding our Puget Sound view to include the Salish Sea, when you talk about forage fish, you sort of have to, because of the Fraser River having such a major influence on circulation and because of migration to different spawning areas and throughout the whole Salish Sea, that fish are using the whole thing. You sort of always have to move across national borders if you want to tell the full story. And then when you get into the mathematical models, then it's a technical question. Does your model boundary actually go that far? And so it depends, because usually models are constructed for a single purpose. And a lot of times that question is, you know, national in scope. But I would say that in general, like conceptually, we should always be, if we're working in Puget Sound and we're interested in marine organisms, we should always be thinking about the Salish Sea as a whole.
All right, thank you so much, Tessa.
Thank you.